Right in front of you, the Red Sea. Dark, wide, no way through. A massive stretch of water cutting the path from side to side, muddy bottom and deep enough to swallow anything that tries to cross. Behind you, the people. 600,000 men on foot, not counting the women and kids. The elderly, the sick, babies in arms, livestock, wagons, animals, all of it packed together, squeezed into a narrow corridor between the water and the mountains, with no way out on either side. And behind the people, the dust. You see the cloud before you see the chariots. That's how an Egyptian army announces itself. By the dust, a column of iron and horse kicks up in the desert. 600 elite war chariots hand-picked by Pharaoh. The entire Egyptian cavalry, the best drivers on the Nile, armed with composite bows that can hit a target dead-on from 200 yards, the most advanced military force in the world at that time. And between them and you, people are screaming at you. It would have been better to be slaves in Egypt than to die here in the desert. That's what's coming out of their mouths. You hear it, every word. 80 years of life, and here you are, cornered between a sea that won't open and an army that won't stop, surrounded by people who'd rather take the whip they know than the unknown risk of being free. But that's not the part that matters. To understand what's going down on this shore today, you gotta understand who you were 40 years ago. And who you were 40 years ago was one of the most unlikely things Egypt ever produced. You were born at the most dangerous moment possible for a Hebrew boy. Pharaoh had just signed the decree. Every male child born to the Hebrews was to be thrown into the Nile. That's not an exaggeration. It's not a figure of speech. It was public policy for an empire worried about the growth rate of a people who'd been living in their territory for 4 generations. The solution Thebes found was simple and cold. Wipe out the next generation before it could take root. You survived because your mother, Jochebed, did something that sounds insane but was the only move she had left. She put you in a papyrus basket waterproofed with tar and pitch and set you in the very river that was supposed to swallow you. The Nile, the sacred river of Egypt. There was a desperate logic to it, the kind of logic only someone with nothing left to lose can see. Your sister Miriam was about 12 at the time. She stayed by the riverbank, hidden in the reeds, watching the basket float downstream. There was no plan B. It was just faith and the current. Pharaoh's daughter went down to the river that day to bathe. Miriam saw it. She ran. She offered a Hebrew wet nurse to care for the child the princess had just fished out of the water. The princess took the deal without a second thought. That nurse was your own mother. For the first 3 years of your life, you were raised by the woman who gave birth to you, paid with Egyptian gold, right inside the palace of the man who wanted you dead. After that, you grew up as the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. That wasn't some honorary title. It was a political reality with real-world consequences. You had access to the Egyptian elite. You ate at the royal table. You studied with the scribes in the temple of Amun. You learned to write in hieroglyphics and Aramaic. You knew the military structure, the religious setup, the bureaucracy of the most powerful empire in the ancient world. You knew how Egypt worked from the inside because you were the inside. But you also knew you were a Hebrew, and that crack was going to split everything down the middle. You're 40 years old when you go out to the labor camps and see an Egyptian overseer beating a Hebrew slave on the ground. The text notes that you looked this way and that before you acted. That detail isn't small. It's the only moment the text lets you reveal who you are, a man with 2 worlds in his chest that didn't fit in either anymore. You killed the overseer. You buried the body in the sand. The next morning you tried to break up a fight between 2 Hebrews. One of them turned to you and said something that flipped your whole life upside down. Who made you prince and judge over us? Are you gonna kill me, like you killed the Egyptian? Everybody knew. Pharaoh found out. He put a hit out on you. You ran without a plan. You left Egypt with nothing but the clothes on your back and the memory of a crime, crossing the desert toward Midian, the parched region between the Gulf of Suez and the Arabian Peninsula. Land of nomad shepherds, of caravans that know every single waterhole, of people who learn to live where an outsider dies in 3 days of heat. You made it to a well, sat down, not knowing what to do. 7 sisters were trying to get water for their father's flocks, and the local shepherds kept chasing them off. You stepped in. The girl's father was Jethro, the priest of Midian, a man of local prestige. He invited you to stay. You stayed. You married Zipporah, the oldest daughter, had 2 sons, and you started working as a shepherd. 40 years of that. 4 decades raising sheep in the Sinai desert, learning how to read the terrain, finding where water hides under the rock during the harshest droughts, getting to know the paths that cross the peninsula from end to end, the shortcuts, the dead ends, the valleys that look promising but lead nowhere, the shallow plains near the Sea of Reeds where an east wind at the right tide can do things you'd never imagine. Those 40 years that felt like exile, punishment, a waste of time, they were preparation. You just didn't know for what yet. And then, on an ordinary day, tending your father-in-law's flock at Mount Horeb, you saw a bush on fire. The fire wasn't consuming it. The bush was burning but stayed standing, green, not turning to ash. You walked closer, and then the voice called your name, twice. Moses! Moses! Like someone who knows the difference between calling a person and making sure they're paying attention. The voice said it was the God of your grandfathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, like someone showing credentials before making an impossible request. After that, he said this, I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out, and I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of there. You were 80 years old, and your answer was no, not directly, of course, but it was a no, 5 times. 5 different arguments, 5 different excuses, which deep down were all the same thing. An old man who'd spent 40 years in the desert, who'd killed someone, who'd run away, who'd raised kids in a foreign land, and who didn't want this smoke at all. Who am I to go to Pharaoh? First, no. What if they ask your name? What do I tell them? Second, no. What if they don't believe me? Third, no. I'm not a good speaker. I'm slow of speech and slow of tongue. Fourth, no. Please, just send someone else. Fifth, no, the most honest one. The text says, the Lord's anger burned against Moses at that 5th argument. Patience was up. Aaron, your older brother, would be your voice, the priest, the one who knew how to speak in public, the one who'd stand out front while you stood to the side, telling him what to repeat. You took the job, not because you wanted it, but because you ran out of arguments. The Egypt you went back to wasn't the same one you fled. The Pharaoh who wanted you dead was gone. The man on the throne now was Ramses. If we're talking the 13th century BC, like most archaeologists do, a man who had fought the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites and walked off the field claiming victory, even though he almost lost everything. A man who built Abu Simbel, Pi-Ramesses, the Ramesseum. A man who carved his name into stone all over Egypt. He knew the value of Hebrew labor better than any accountant, because that labor was what built the cities that carried his name. Aaron was 83. You were 80. 2 old men walking into Pharaoh's palace with a staff and a message. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go. Pharaoh shot back. Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. And he jacked up the slaves' workload. From then on, they had to find their own straw to make bricks, something the state used to provide, and the daily quota stayed exactly the same. The Hebrew leaders who couldn't hit the quota were beaten by the Egyptian overseers. They walked out of Pharaoh's presence straight to you and Aaron and said, "You've made us a stench in Pharaoh's nostrils. You've put a sword in their hands to kill us." That's the scene that plays out for months. You act. Things get worse before they get better. The people blame you. The plagues came one by one over weeks, maybe months, in a progression that scholars can track with natural logic. The Nile turned to blood, or turned red from a massive toxic algae bloom, which happens from time to time in that region. The fish died. The frogs living on the banks swarmed the land to escape the contaminated water. Then they died on land. Rotting frogs created the perfect environment for lice and gnats to explode in numbers. The insects brought disease to the livestock. The sores on the cattle spread to the humans. Hail during the planting season wrecked the Nile's agricultural cycle. Locusts ate whatever was left. And finally, 3 days of total darkness, likely a sandstorm of the kind Egypt still sees today, the kind that blocks out the sun for days and feels like the end of the world to anyone caught in it. Every plague in Egypt took a shot at one of the Egyptian gods. The Nile turning to blood was an insult to Hapi, the god of the river. The darkness was an insult to Ra, the sun god, the most important of all. There was a theological logic behind the ecological one. Every sign was an argument against a different deity in the Egyptian pantheon. Bezalel, son of Uri, was a craftsman working with gold and silver in the royal workshops of Pyrameses. He was 40, eyes used to fine detail, hands that could do things with metal other smiths just watched in awe. He saw you walk into the palace. He saw the plagues. He saw the Egyptian overseers starting to treat the Hebrews with 1 degree less brutality after every sign. He didn't know exactly what to think of you. You looked Egyptian. You talked differently than the people in Goshen. But something in him recognized that things were heading somewhere that 4 generations of slavery hadn't been able to reach. Caleb, son of Jephunneh, was 32, tribe of Judah, He grew up in the Nile Delta watching the elders bow their heads as an automatic reflex whenever an Egyptian passed by. There was something in him that wouldn't bow, not out of arrogance, but out of a quiet conviction that the whole thing made no sense, that what was happening wasn't the destiny of this people. You noticed that in him before you even knew his name. Pharaoh would cave, then harden his heart. Cave, then harden. Every time a plague hit, he'd call you and Aaron and say, "Go." And as soon as the plague passed, he'd change his mind. 6 times that happened. 6 times you went back with hope and came away with nothing, until the 10th plague. The night before the departure, every Hebrew family stayed inside with the blood of a lamb on the doorframe and the 2 side posts. The kids inside stayed alive. In the Egyptian houses that night, from the palace to the last shack in the fields, the firstborn sons died. The text says there wasn't a single house without someone dead in it. And in the middle of the night, Pharaoh called for you, him, personally, with the look in his eyes that any father of a dead son has in that moment. And he said, "Go, take the people, take the flocks, take everything. Bless me too when you leave. Just go." Now. All of Egypt pushed the people out. They gave them silver jewelry, gold jewelry, clothes, supplies, 430 years of slavery, and Egypt paid for the exit with its own hands. You left with 600,000 men on foot, plus women, plus kids, plus the elderly, and a mixed multitude. The text uses that exact phrase. Likely Egyptians married to Hebrews or other enslaved groups who saw the opening and took it. A column of people that, if you take the numbers literally, would hit 2 million. In front, a pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night. The way was being shown, but you made a choice on the route that nobody understood. The direct route to Canaan was along the Mediterranean coast, short, well-marked, relatively flat. But that was exactly where Egypt had military forts every 2 days of marching along what they called the Via Maris, the Way of Horus. You didn't go that way. You turned toward the Sinai Desert, longer, harder, no infrastructure, but no Egyptian garrisons in the way. The people complained about that too. 3 days without water, and the first spring they found, Mara, was bitter, useless. They complained. You threw a piece of wood into the water and it turned sweet. They kept going to Elim, which the text describes with unusual precision, 12 springs and 70 palm trees. The scribe who recorded that couldn't help but note the numbers. It was like the scene of good water and shade in the desert hit him so hard he couldn't summarize it without the details. Then they reached the desert of sin. The food ran out, and the complaining came back with a force you hadn't seen yet. If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted. Pots of meat, that detail sticks in your head. These people were beaten to the ground. Their sons were drowned in the Nile. They were treated like pack animals by a state that didn't recognize their humanity. But what stayed in their memory, what their tongues go looking for when nostalgia hits, is the meat pot. That's what you carry through this whole desert. It's not just Pharaoh behind you, it's also the selective memory of a people who prefer familiar suffering over the unknown risk of being free. The manna came, the quail came. Water gushed from the rock when you struck it with your staff at Rephidim. And the text says you were ticked off in that moment, that you hit the rock twice when you were supposed to hit it once, that you called the people rebels. It's one of the most human moments in the whole story. The man who split a sea losing his cool with people who ask for water the wrong way. The Amalekites came to attack when the column was weak and tired. Joshua, a young man from Ephraim you'd picked to lead the fighters, went down to the battlefield. You went up to the top of the hill with the staff raised. As long as the staff was up, Israel was winning. When your arm got tired and the staff dropped, Amalek pushed back. Aaron and Hur stood on either side of you, holding your arms up until sunset. It's one of the strangest images in the Bible. The most powerful intercessor the people had needed 2 men holding his arms up so the battle wouldn't turn. And then the warning came that you knew was coming eventually. Pharaoh had changed his mind. 6 days after freeing 2 million people with the Delta cities at a standstill, the harvest destroyed, the livestock dead, and the firstborn buried, Ramses woke up, looked in the mirror at what Egypt had become, and said something the texts recorded perfectly. What have we done? We've let Israel go and lost their service. It wasn't moral regret. It was a loss and gain calculation. 600 chosen chariots, the whole cavalry, captains over all of them, the cutting edge of Pharaoh's army at full throttle. Following the trail, 2 million people leave in the desert, a trail any kid could follow. They caught the Israelite column at Pi Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. Trapped, sea in front, army on the flanks, mountains blocking the way out. And that's when you saw the dust cloud. The people lose their minds. That's not a figure of speech. The text describes screams, terror, rage aimed at you, specifically calling you out. The scene is total chaos. Kids crying, old folks on the ground who can't get back up, women clutching babies while the dust from those 600 chariots gets closer every second. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? That's the level of what you're hearing, angry sarcasm in the middle of a panic attack. It would have been better to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. And you answer, with a line that still stops people in their tracks today, do not be afraid, stand still, see the salvation of the Lord, which he will perform for you today. The Lord will fight for you, you only need to be still. Be still, with 600 war chariots 100 yards away. But after that public statement, the voice calls you aside and says something different. Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move out. Move out where? Into the closed sea in front of them. You raise the staff over the water. A strong east wind started to blow, not suddenly. The text is specific about this. It says the wind blew all night long, making the waters recede through the early morning hours. For hours, the seabed dried out slowly, a strip of land emerging between the two masses of water. You knew this wind. 40 years in the Sinai, you knew what the east wind did on the shallow plains near the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, which the Greek translation later called the Red Sea, but was likely a series of shallow lakes on the edge of the Gulf of Suez, sensitive to tide and wind. Modern researchers have documented that a sustained 60-mile-per-hour wind can push water back in certain terrain configurations and create a land bridge for hours. That didn't make the miracle smaller. It made it bigger, because the instrument of the miracle was exactly the knowledge that 40 years of exile had deposited in this old shepherd who never wanted the job. The pillar of cloud and fire moved. It went to the back. It stood between the people of Israel and the Egyptian army. On the Egyptian side, total darkness. On the Israelite side, light. The people crossed, with walls of water on each side, all night long. The morning light started to break. The Egyptian army followed them in. The ramps of mud and sand that had held the weight of 2 million people on foot started to give way under the combined weight of chariots and horses. The wheels got stuck, the horses panicked. The drivers screamed a phrase the scribe who recorded that day kept as if he'd heard it with his own ears. "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." You stretched out your staff over the sea a second time. The water crashed back. Pharaoh's army, chariots, horsemen, captains, the whole cavalry covered by the water. The text says not one of them was left. Miriam was over 90 years old that day. The same woman who had stood by the Nile watching a papyrus basket decades before picked up a tambourine and started dancing by the water. The text says the other women followed her with tambourines, dancing in choruses. Miriam the prophetess sang, "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea." The people sang, the song of Moses. Scholars consider this text one of the oldest in the entire Bible, maybe composed centuries before the written form of the Pentateuch, preserved in oral tradition with a precision guaranteed by its use in worship. You stood there looking at the still water, not because the moment wasn't huge, but because you knew what came next. On the other side of this sea that just closed, there was a desert you knew like the back of your hand. And these people who were dancing now were going to cross that desert with you for 40 more years. 40 years of complaining, of idolatry, of building a golden calf 40 days after hearing the voice of God at Sinai, of missing Egypt, of trying to go back, of wars against Canaanites, of water crises, of food crises, of your leadership being questioned, of Aaron and Miriam talking behind your back. And at the end of those 40 years, you weren't going to enter the promised land. You'd find that out on a future day, because of a rock, because of one time when impatience was stronger than obedience. You'd stand on Mount Nebo, on the other side of the Jordan, see the land from a distance, and die right there, at 120 years old, with your vision still clear and your strength intact, according to the text. A man who could have gone, but didn't. But in that moment, with the sun rising over the Sea of Reeds, with Miriam dancing and the people singing, with Pharaoh's army at the bottom of the water, you gripped your staff and turned your face toward the desert horizon. It was massive, and it was the only way forward. You learned something that none of the 600,000 men behind you had learned yet. The crossing isn't freedom. The crossing is just the end of slavery. Freedom is something else. Freedom is what happens in the desert that comes after. And the desert is gonna charge you for everything. Patience, faith, memory, identity, who you are when you don't have anyone's whip behind you and you have to decide for yourself who you're gonna be. Most of the people dancing on that beach were going to die in the desert before they saw the other side. But the next generation, their kids, they were going in. You had opened the way, and that was all that had been asked of you. Deliverance doesn't come from a miracle. It comes from 40 years of preparation that look like exile until the day you finally understand what they were for. If you want to understand what happens when these people finally reach the edge of the promised land after 40 years in the desert and fear speaks louder than faith, subscribe to the channel because the story still has a lot of chapters left.